According to a bombshell new study, the divergence of modern sapiens from archaic sapiens was older than 500,000 years. This is not fringe science. This is the conclusion of a peer-reviewed study conducted by leading scientists from both Europe and Asia. This cannot be ignored. The study proves that Eurasia was never the stage for a single grand entrance. It was not a blank continent waiting for one modern human population to burst out of Africa, sweep across the old world, and replace everything in its path like a tide. That picture is emotionally satisfying because it is simple. It gives us a neat origin point, a clean, branching tree, and an easy story to tell. But the deeper you look, at skulls, at teeth, at faces, at cranial vault shapes, and especially at genomes, the more that story begins to wobble. And then it collapses. The truth is more complicated, more brutal, and far more fascinating. Eurasia was built by a long-running network of populations, a braided river system of ancestry and adaptation. There was no single modern human type. There were several. And the fossil record, when read correctly, is screaming that the Eurasian story is not one migration but multiple waves, multiple lineages, regional continuity, and repeated remixing across tens of thousands of years. We won't go into all the reasons that out of Ethiopia 50,000 years ago is a failed hypothesis, because we have covered that topic in several other videos recently. Out of Ethiopia requires a mass extinction of every Homo sapiens outside of sub-Saharan Africa just before 50,000 years ago. But there was no mass extinction. There was no manifest destiny, no rapid colonization of the world by one chosen people. This morphological chart from a 2025 study, co-authored by the leading British paleoanthropologist in the world and a former strict out-of-Africa proponent, makes the problem visible in a way that even genetics sometimes fails to communicate. It clusters fossils not by myth, not by labels like archaic or modern, but by morphology. In this chart, the key shock is not simply where a fossil align, it is the fact that the Eurasian samples do not collapse into one coherent, recent sapiens cluster. Instead, they separate into at least three major Eurasian morphological lineages, separated by nearly 500,000 years. A Cro-Magnon European lineage, a Skull-Kafse-Levantine lineage, and an Eastern lineage that pulls together fossils of Oasi from Romania and East Asian early moderns like Upper Cave and Liujiang. The numbers are not genomic split times, but the structure itself is the important message. The conclusion is simple. Eurasia was not colonized by one uniform population that diversified later. Eurasia looks, right at the start, like a continent already populated by distinct forms of Homo sapiens, forms that were not simply cosmetic variants, but the outcomes of separate histories, separate bottlenecks, separate ecologies, ghost populations, and separate interactions with archaic humans. The first Eurasian lineage, the Cro-Magnon, is where the myth begins to die. Cro-Magnon is routinely packaged as the definitive modern human of Ice Age Europe. Tall, artistic Aurignacian, the great replacement hero who overwhelmed Neanderthals. But when you actually look at many Upper Paleolithic European skulls, something feels wrong. They can be strikingly robust. They can look archaic in their vault thickness, brow architecture, facial proportions, and cranial ruggedness. Not Neanderthal, but not cleanly modern either. In the morphological chart, Cro-Magnon doesn't nestle neatly as a simple continuation of any African lineage, or a close relative of other early Europeans, such as Oase and Moladek. It sits apart, distinct enough to demand explanation. The only way to force Cro-Magnon into the classic story is to insist that modern humans exited sub-Saharan East Africa as one type and then rapidly turned into Cro-Magnon. But that is an extraordinary claim, and the chart quietly calls it out. Cro-Magnon is not merely a recent African descendant with colder weather adaptations. The European lineage looks like it carries its own distinct history, one shaped by founder effects, drift in small pioneering populations, intense selection in Ice Age environments, and likely multiple admixture and replacement events within Europe itself. Now the genetics enters the room and makes the implications unavoidable. Neanderthal ancestry is not a single clean event. It is not one tiny pulse outside Africa that everyone inherited equally. The distribution of introgressed Neanderthal DNA is messy, structured and inconsistent, with a simplistic one-time encounter narrative. Some early modern humans, like the individual from Oase in Romania, had a very recent Neanderthal ancestor, so recent that the genome contains long segments of archaic DNA that hadn't yet been broken up by recombination. This is the reason that Out of Africa demands that Neanderthals be kept a separate species, because if they are the same species, then modern humans are not only from Africa, and interbreeding is not an interspecies event. Interbreeding does not become hybridization, it becomes shared ancestry, it becomes population mixing, it becomes normal. That also means interbreeding was happening deep in Eurasia, and not just at some hypothetical gateway outside Africa. It means interaction zones existed across the continent, shifting like weather fronts, sometimes expanding, sometimes collapsing, producing hybrids, absorbing them, and sometimes letting those hybrid lineages go extinct. Cro-Magnon Europe was not a sealed modern enclave expanding into Neanderthal land. It was a frontier. And frontiers do not produce purity. They produce mixtures, bottlenecks, and strange forms. The second Eurasian lineage, Skulcafsa, is the Levantine key to the entire puzzle, because it represents an early modern human presence outside Africa that is both undeniable and inconvenient. Skul and Kafsa are too old to fit the single Out of Africa at 50-60K myth. They are early, and they are anatomically modern enough to make it impossible to pretend Eurasia was empty of sapiens until the Upper Paleolithic. But they also don't look like Cro-Magnon. They form their own cluster, Levantine early modern humans, shaped by their own environment and likely their own population history. The Levant is not just a corridor, it is a habitat. It is a semi-permanent refuge, a Mediterranean crossroads, a place where populations could survive through climatic oscillations, retreat and return. Skulcafse-type people don't have to be failed migrations. They can be part of a living network, one node in a wider Eurasian metapopulation system that predates the later Upper Paleolithic expansions. This matters because it reframes the entire logic of human origins. The standard model often assumes a single expansion that created all non-Africans, but the presence of distinct Levantine early modern morphology suggests something else. Eurasia may have had multiple foundational sapiens presences at different times from different source populations with different degrees of archaic mixture. The Levantine population did not go extinct. They gave birth the later Europeans, including the Maladek population, which is a morphological continuum of the 55,000 years old Manot cranium from the Levant. Skulcafsa could represent one early Mediterranean adapted lineages, possibly connected to North African and Nile corridor systems, while later lineages came through different pathways and carried different genetic packages. This helps explain why we see profound heterogeneity in early Eurasian fossils, why modernity appears as a mosaic, and why a neat branching tree fails. The Levantine lineages is not just a footnote. It is evidence that the modern human story outside Africa begins early and develops regionally. 50,000-year-old tools from the Levant also are the predecessors of the first European tool industries and show continuity with Skulcafsa from 100,000 years ago. The third Eurasian lineage is where the story becomes truly mind-blowing, because it challenges the deepest assumption of all, that Eurasia was filled from west to east by one expanding modern population. The morphological chart groups fossils like Oase, Upper Cave and Lujiang into a cluster that feels directionally eastern, not Levantine. Whether every placement in the chart is perfect is less important than the broader signal. Early modern humans in Eurasia do not align into one tight family. East Asia does not look like a simple branch off a Levantine trunk. It looks like an alternate lineage with its own trajectory. The genetic story supports this disruptive picture. East Asians often carry different patterns of archaic ancestry compared with West Eurasians, not simply more or less, but different segments, different histories. Denisovan ancestry is not distributed like a simple echo of one expansion. It is geographically and structurally uneven, suggesting that deep Eurasian structure, population subgroups with distinct archaic contacts, persisted for a long time. Oase, in particular, becomes a symbol of what the textbooks try to hide. It is not a clean European modern. It is a hybridized frontier human whose ancestry reminds us that Europe was not populated by a single uniform modern population pushing forward. Oase shows recent Neanderthal ancestry. It also does not fit neatly as ancestral to later Europeans. That means a population can exist, mixed deeply with Neanderthals, and then disappear, extinct, absorbed, replaced, or diluted. That is exactly what you expect in a braided network, and it is exactly what you do not expect in the classic replacement story. Now apply this logic eastward. If frontier populations in Europe were mixing and disappearing, why would East Asia be any simpler? It wouldn't. The eastern lineage likely includes multiple expansions into Asia, multiple contacts with archaics, and long stretches of regional continuity in which populations adapt to local environments, drift into new morphologies, and retain or lose archaic genetic architecture depending on selection. And selection is the silent engine here, the factor that makes morphology lie if you treat it as a clock, but also the factor that makes morphology valuable as a signal of regional history. The skull is not just a neutral record of ancestry. It is a structure under selection, directly and indirectly. Climate affecting nasal form and cranial shape, diet affecting jaw mechanics, body size affecting vault proportions, energetic constraints shaping developmental patterns. In cold environments, robusticity can return. In small, bottlenecked populations, drift can amplify unusual traits. In island-like refugia, mountain valleys, coastal enclaves, forest belts, founder effects can reshape populations fast. Cro-Magnon looks archaic not necessarily because it is ancient, but because Ice Age Europe, selected for robustness and drift, magnified it. Skullkafse looks distinct because the Levant was its own evolutionary theatre. The eastern lineage looks separate because Asia was never just an endpoint. It was a continent-sized laboratory. Put all of this together, and the one modern human-type idea becomes almost impossible to defend. Eurasia was never a single narrative, it was a web. Multiple expansions occurred, not just one. Populations persisted regionally, not just transiently. Neanderthal introgression happened repeatedly in different places, not one clean event at a gate. Drift and founder effects sculpted populations in ways that make later fossils look startlingly different from one another. Strong local selection produced convergences and reversals that make modernity appear and disappear in the skull. And extinction, constant brutal extinction, pruned whole branches that once existed but left only faint traces in fossils and fragments in genomes. This is what changes everything. We are not the descendants of a single heroic migration of modern humans. We are the survivors of a Eurasian network. Eurasia was not populated by one simple modern human type. It was populated by a mosaic of Homo sapiens populations, each carrying different histories, different archaic mixtures, and different adaptive signatures. Were modern-looking humans walking the planet 500,000 years ago? Cro-Magnon, Skullkafse Mladek, and Oase Lujiang Upper Cave are not merely fossils. They are warnings that the true human story is not linear, it is complex, it is messy, it is ancient. And once you see those three lineages, you can't unsee them. Thanks for watching.